lesson, we're going to be focusing on understanding Scrooge's attitude towards giving to charity and his opinion of the poor. So as mentioned before, because this is a 19th century text, quite often you're going to find some vocabulary that you might not be familiar with as a modern day reader. So I'm just going to introduce you to some of the words that you might come across in this section of the text. So the first word is cordially, which means to be warm and friendly. The next word is liberality, which means giving or spending freely. We've got the word credentials, which is providing achievements or a proof of who you are. We've got the word kindred, which means that interests are the same or your interests are the same as somebody else. We've got the word omnious, giving the impression that something is bad. Vigour, which means strength or good health. Abundance, large quantity of something. Anonymous, someone you can't identify. If someone is anonymous, you can't identify them. Idle, which means you avoid work or you're lazy. Surplus, more than what is needed. Facetious, treating issues with inappropriate humour. And finally, we've got misanthropic, which means a strong dislike of people. So as I mentioned previously, there's also going to be some historical references that we might not be aware of as a 21st century reader. At the beginning of the text, Scrooge mentions about being committed to Bedlam, and Bedlam was one of the world's oldest mental hospitals. There's also a mention of sending the working class to a union workhouse, and we mentioned this back in lesson 1, but that's where you went to live and work if you were poor. He also mentions about the working class being on a treadmill, and the treadmill was a method of punishment that was used in Victorian prisons. You might think about sort of like a hamster wheel going round, and that was used as a punishment. There's a reference to some poor people that are surrounding a brazier, and a brazier is a portable heater. There's a mention to a number of shops, such as a poulterer that would sell chickens. It mentions the idea of living in a garret, and a garret is a top floor attic where whole families would sometimes live. And then finally, at the end of the section, there is a reference to the game Blind Man's Buff, which is a game that was traditionally played at Christmas by the Victorians. So let's move on to reading the next section of the text. His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hand and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago, this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." Okay, let's look at this section again in a little bit more detail. So in this section, we have Scrooge's nephew Fred, who's leaving, and at the same time 2 charity workers who are arriving and asking Scrooge to donate to the poor. It says that his nephew Fred left the room without an angry word. Now, bearing in mind how rude Scrooge has been to him and refuses to go to his house for dinner, this shows how Scrooge's nephew is too nice and happy to be angry on this festive occasion. Dickens also mentions how the clerk, who cold as he was warmer than Scrooge. Now this doesn't mean that the clerk is literally more warmer, because he can't even keep this fire going, but instead it's describing the clerk's soul. It's reminding the reader how Dickens is trying to convey the message that money, the cold on the outside, or represented by Scrooge, is not needed to be happy or warm on the inside. Scrooge also mentions that he'll retire to Bedlam, which is a mental hospital, which shows that he fails to understand the message of Christmas and he fails to understand what reason his clerk has to be happy. In the next section, it mentions that Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. It shows that Scrooge has actually got some pretty bad past memories of Christmas Eve, as this is when Marley died, and he lost what's referred to really as his only friend. This might be a reason why he hates Christmas. Later, the word liberality, which represents the overall Christmas spirit, the idea of giving money, being generous, is described as being omnious, which shows Scrooge has a negative attitude towards it. In the last section, it reminds the reader that hundreds of thousands of people are poor and only require common comforts, i.e. they're only really asking for the basics. So let's move on to reading the next section. So the gentleman had just asked Scrooge for some money towards charity, and this is his reply. "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christmas cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would die," said Scrooge, "they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." This section of the text in a bit more detail. So, first of all, Scrooge mentions that the poor should live in prisons and workhouses. This hints that he believes that all poor are guilty of something or potentially criminals. This linked with a widespread belief amongst the middle classes that the poor were lazy and not just victims of circumstance. He fails to understand why he should give them money. The gentleman also mentioned some basic necessities such as meat, drink and warmth, which shows just how badly the working class were treated in the workhouses and prisons. Scrooge believes that he already pays towards the prisons and the workhouses through taxes, so he can't understand why he should part with more money in order to do this. The fact that Scrooge wishes to be left alone shows Scrooge's attitude towards the community. Christmas is normally a time for family and friends, a time that's spent with people, not alone. This shows he is closed off or wishes to be as solitary as an oyster. Scrooge referring to the poor as being idle again re-emphasises Scrooge's view on the poor as being lazy. This would also reflect the Victorian society on the working classes during that period of time. So moving on with the next section of the text. "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, preferring their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the cloud. tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. So looking again at this section of the text, we've got at the beginning the fact that Scrooge says, "It's not my business." This shows a very capitalistic manner by him not giving to the poor and destitute. He also constantly refers to the word business to emphasise this. His capitalist viewpoint shows how he believes that the poor living in poverty is nothing to do with him and nothing he can do anything about. Later in this extract, Dickens refers to pathetic fallacy. The mood later on turns dark as ghosts start arriving, thus the setting is becoming more and more gloomy. The use of personification, with the church bell peeping slyly, links to Scrooge's lack of Christian sensibilities. There's a suggestion that God himself is watching Scrooge, and as religion was a fundamental part of Victorian lives, this adds to the impression that Scrooge does not believe in Christian qualities or the qualities that should be celebrated and presented at Christmas. Reading through the next section of the text. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug, being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trade became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty Mansion House, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas, as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold, if the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. So the atmospheric description at the start is interesting, as Dickens is presenting the great divide between rich and poor. The ragged men and boys in this section were in rapture over a fire in the street. Rapture means in great delight, while in contrast the Lord Mayor is preparing for Christmas with 50 cooks and butlers. Even the working class, which are represented by the tailor here, live only in a garret, which is a small attic room, and his wife is described as lean, which means thin. Dickens quietly reminds us that only the very wealthy are comfortable here. This links to the theme of poverty and also to the importance of charity and caring for others. In addition to this, Dickens is emphasising how everyone, both rich and poor, celebrate Christmas, which therefore makes Scrooge seem even more of an outsider. Later in this extract, Scrooge, in response to a poverty-stricken carol singer, is described as seizing a ruler with such energy of action in order to ward off and petrify this carol singer. The verb seize connotates a forceful, out of anger snatch, implying that Scrooge is so enraged by him that it conjures a harsh reaction. This highlights how tight he is with his money, as he doesn't want to give him money for singing, and again how desperate Scrooge is to avoid any reference to Christmas. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop £half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide on Cornhill, at the end of the lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blindman's Buff. In this section, the end of the working day has finally come, and we see how desperate Bob Cratchit is to get home to his family, as he instantly snuffs out his candle and puts on his hat. And again later, Scrooge mentions, "And yet," says Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." This shows him again as being a tight-fisted and uncaring employer. He doesn't like Cratchit having even one day off, even if it is a family holiday. He is unable to feel any compassion or generosity towards his employee. When it says a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, it shows that Scrooge thinks it's pretty much daylight robbery for him to be paying for his clerk to have a day off. This shows that Scrooge believes that you should always be working and never be with family. It also shows again Scrooge's opinion of Christmas, as he refers to it being a robber. When it says be here all the earlier next morning, it shows that Scrooge again is a harsh employer. He begrudgingly gives Bob the day off and demands he makes up for it the next day. It's almost a punishment for taking Christmas Day off work. The final section shows Bob's excitement that he gets to spend Christmas Day with his family as he runs home. We're reminded of Bob's poverty as he boasts no great coat. His excitement is juxtaposed against Scrooge's growling and resentful attitude.